All right, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Beyond Compliance. 2022 is here and the calendar is already filling up with a lot of great speakers, and we're happy to start us off in January here with a great topic. My name is Aaron Bolshaw. I'm with Safety Chain Software and the moderator of Beyond Compliance, which for anyone that isn't aware is a periodic industry update for process manufacturers. The goal is simple: bring you insights around the marketplace that shape the way we grow our businesses and food, deliver quality products to customers, mitigate supply chain risk, and safeguard all of our brands. Of course, all while improving yields and maximizing productivity. So we're getting right into the heart of FSMA 204 and how, quite frankly, there could be some room for improvement in the traceability standard across the board. And I've got the perfect person joining me to go through that. Before we start, Safety Chain is the #1 plant management platform with empowering process manufacturers and food producers in North America. And we also want to make sure everyone knows how to ask questions. We think there's going to be some great questions today, so we will save some time at the end to connect with you. As we go through the presentation, go ahead and use that console on your right, and we'll save some time, like I said, at the end. Everyone's on mute, so you can only hear us. We can't hear you, but ultimately, to answer everyone's favorite question off the top, if you would like to get the slides and the recording from today, all you got to do is ask. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Jennifer McIntyre. She's the Chief Food Safety and Regulatory Officer at IFPA, and impressive background. I am routinely humbled by the folks that come and visit us at Beyond Compliance. A microbiologist for 20+ years, working in the DC area. Roles in her past include VP of Science Operations at the Grocery Manufacturers Association, VP and Chief Science Officer at our friends, the Atchison Group, Senior Staff Scientist and Director of Science and Technology Products at IFT, the Institute of Food Technologists. So really cool background in biology and technology. So currently a board member, also is the, well, I'm not sure if it's current, but I apologize, advisory board member for Global Food Traceability Center, and also PhD from Rutgers University. Welcome to Beyond Compliance, Jennifer.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Yes, wow, again, very humbled to have you here. Very great topic, and I like how you're approaching this as we've put this together over the last few weeks. We're taking an approach here that really just kind of stares at sort of this, the FSMA 204D versus the industry and kind of what's really going on. Jennifer, before we get into the meat of that, will you tell us a little bit about IFPA, what's going on in your neck of the woods?
Sure. So the International Fresh Produce Association is it's quite new, just a couple weeks old. It is the trade association for the fresh produce and floral supply chain. So it was born from United Fresh Produce Association, where I spent 5.5 years, as well as the Produce Marketing Association, which I worked very closely with, especially when it came to things like produce traceability. So at IFPA, our purpose is to advocate on behalf of the industry, to connect the industry, and also to provide guidance to the produce industry. Again, it's the global produce and floral supply chains, all points in the supply chain, not just growers or processors or distributors or retailers, but all points. And I think that that's what gives us a really unique position, especially when we think about something like traceability that does require and touch all those points in the supply chain.
Yes, and I am going to make you presenter because I did not yet, or actually I'm going to let you share this mouse. I haven't done that yet, but you should have control of it now, Jennifer. So thank you for that about IFTA, and you've got quite a team there.
We do. So I'm on the food safety side. That's my background, kind of a generalist. I got into traceability about 12 years ago, just kind of by accident. And I've worked on traceability, thinking about it for all foods, all sectors, I'm really lucky at IFPA that we also have Ed Tracy. Ed was kind of my counterpart, my colleague on the PMA side. His background is in supply chain, working with the industry, really hands-on. He runs a blockchain group. He's a real expert when it comes to produce traceability, specifically PTI. So I think him with the supply chain background, me with the food safety background, it kind of illustrates that traceability is not just the job of one person. It's not just the interest of one person. It does take a village. And it's a blessing and a curse, of course, because it may mean within some companies that there's not that single person with responsibility for just traceability, but it does require input, and I think we'll benefit from the expertise of everybody contributing to the traceability related conversations. One of the things I want to emphasize right off the bat is that traceability is a tool. It is not an answer in and of itself. It's not a solution in and of itself. And often when I'm working with companies and we're talking about traceability, and I said, well, what is it that you want? And they said, we want better traceability. I follow up with why. What is the problem that you're trying to solve? What is this a tool for? Why bother following the movement of product? And there can be many answers to this question. And the way that you answer the question for your company, what you're looking for a traceability system to do, may guide you toward the right system for you, the right data elements to be looking at, really your whole approach and ideology, whether you're looking at this from the standpoint of marketing, wanting to connect with consumers, have them understand where their food is coming from, whether you're looking at authenticating claims around the product. Is this really organic? Is it really sustainably grown? Whether you're looking at supply chain efficiencies. So, you want to have better control, be a little bit tighter when it comes to your supply chain. If you're looking at it from a food safety standpoint, from a regulatory compliance standpoint, we want to be able to recall more quickly, more granularly. We simply want to be in compliance. I'll talk about that a bit more. There are technologies and systems that can support all of this. But again, having that clarity around for you as a company, what do you want to do, is, I think, the first step. Very useful. So when it comes to regulatory compliance, I think it's an interesting exercise to kind of flip that question around and say, if FDA, if the government wants better traceability, why? And let's dig in a little bit into what they might be looking for. So what is the problem that the regulators are trying to solve? I think my belief is that they want to increase the speed of recalls, have them executed much more quickly. The reason for that, kind of obvious, so that people can't eat contaminated food. Let's pull it out of the supply chain, pull it out of distribution. Also to increase the speed of tracebacks, especially during outbreak investigations, and figure out what is causing illness. This is necessary. Until you know what's causing illness, until you know what's causing an outbreak, you can't execute a recall. So time is of the essence as people are getting sick and the cause is unknown. So can we speed up that process? Many people will note that we've had this one up, one down, one forward, one back traceability record keeping system for many, many, many years, and question, what's the problem? We're already doing this. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard from different parts of the food industry, different types of companies, we have great traceability. We're doing it. So what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And I thought what I'd do is a little compare and contrast between recalls and tracebacks, because again, often when I'm talking to food companies, they tend to go toward the recall side. We do mock recalls all the time. We can recall something within whatever, 2 hours, 4 hours, 10 minutes. And a recall is vastly different from a traceback. So the problem that a company is trying to solve in using records, traceability records. And the problem that the regulator is trying to solve, again, are very, very different. So recalls are led by the industry. They are initiated by a company, often called a voluntary recall, and they're recalling something very specific. It's, this is the brand, this is the food, this is the UPC or the lot number, expiration date. There's some specificity to what is being recalled. And as that information is communicated through the supply chain, you may wind up, especially at retail, where they're just going to clear the shelves, especially for an item like produce that may not have the markings at the point that it's out on display for people. So adding those buffers in that case is protective. You don't want to risk that someone is going to accidentally purchase a product that shouldn't be out there, shouldn't be in distribution anymore. A traceback is vastly different. The traceback is led by FDA, led by the states, not led by a company, because at this point in time, the food is not known. That is actually the objective of the traceback, is to figure out what is the food that's causing illness. So they're adding buffers to say, well, as a company, this is what I had in stock, but may have also had product from the supplier, might have also had that lot number. Then it actually causes confusion, because that signal of what specifically is the product that is problematic, that signal is getting diluted by the noise. I want to spend just a minute walking through at a very high level the basics of the outbreak investigation process. So it all starts with people. This is about people who eat food that made them sick, and they may or usually may not seek medical attention. So if they go to the doctor, then is a sample ordered, a stool sample? Is it analyzed? Is it sent up through the public health lab system? Is that information about that organism, that illness, entered into a database? This is a database that CDC is monitoring quite regularly to see when there's an uptick in a certain type of pathogen, certain type of illness, to say, there might be an outbreak here. Let's investigate this a little bit more. And at the point that there are illnesses in several states that warrant CDC's involvement, think there might be an outbreak, CDC will ask the states to ask people, what did you eat in the days or weeks before you became ill? And it's quite a process to whittle that down. If you think of all the foods that you ate, especially some time has passed now since you first got sick, think about what you ate and try to see what these different people in different states had in common. If they can narrow the focus down to a particular type of food, maybe a couple types of food, that's when FDA gets involved and starts looking into the food a little bit more. So CDC focusing on the people, FDA focusing on the food itself. Where did that food come from? And this is the traceback question. Where did the food come from? The result, hopefully, if we can figure out where the food came from, is to really uncover what happened. Well, but that's a little bit of a later point in the process. Now, things would be really simple if when people talked about what they ate, it was kind of obvious, that all these sick people ate a very unusual product or a very specific brand. Then you can start to look into that a little bit more deeply. And if it's a shelf-stable product, something that hangs around for a while, there is the ability to test leftovers. What's in somebody's refrigerator, what's in their pantry. In the case of produce, the timing is usually not advantageous for us. The product is generally gone, weeks gone. But sometimes, it is possible to test a product. We've seen this historical examples like peanut butter, where the state can go in, test the peanut butter, it tests positive. Well, then you can turn that container around and you can say, what is the lot number on this container? So the answer then is there, it's obvious, it's a smoking gun. But more often than not, we don't have that opportunity. We have to take the other path on the right-hand side of using the traceback records to try to figure out for this product, is there a common source? And what that looks like, and many of you have probably seen some of FDA's traceback diagrams, it is using currently this one-back system. So the POS stands for point of sale. These are the different locations where people have reported eating food or purchasing food. So they might be restaurants, cafeterias, grocery stores. And the investigation starts where there are some good leads. So several people ate at this particular restaurant. They were not related to each other, but they all got sick. Okay, and they, let's look at what was on the menu. Let's start looking at the ingredients, and let's start figuring out where those ingredients came from, working back each point in the supply chain until hopefully, ideally, you'd come up with that single box on the right-hand side as you've traced back from these 4 different starting points, gone through a couple of different distributors, brokers, suppliers, and figured out, oh, it's this particular farm that happened to provide all of them. We think that that's where the issue may have originated from. But I would ask you to kind of put yourself in the investigator's shoes and think about if you have to go through all the records at every single box on this slide, and you're looking at trying to line up dates, trying to line up purchase orders, trying to line up bills of lading and get them to connect over a couple day or couple week time frame to find that one thing they have in common. It is a difficult exercise. And so putting yourself in their shoes, you can kind of understand why they want to see some improvements to the process. But I would go back to my original question, what is the problem we're trying to solve? If the problem we're trying to solve is where did the food actually come from, those points in between, one could make the case that they're not really relevant. If you are simply getting a box in, sending a box out, you're not doing anything to the product, then maybe we don't need to go in every instance through every single point in the supply chain. Maybe we can just, if that point of sale knew I got, say point of sale A goes back to I got from grower A and grower B. If that information could be communicated instantaneously for point of sale A, B, C, D, this process should happen a lot more quickly. And that's part of, to give a little bit of a preview on the proposed rule, that's kind of part of what's being asked, that the information about that source, that original lot code, the traceability lot code, would carry forward so that we don't have all the translations happening at the in-between points in the supply chain. So what would those data elements be? This is totally my opinion. So this is not what's in the proposed rule, because I think that the proposed rule goes, to me, a little bit overboard. But to trace back, who is the company that made the product? What did they actually make? So as granular an identification as possible. Generally, the lot number is the most granular that we can get. When is a useful data element if you need to go back and try to discover what actually happened, what went wrong? Then you need to know when the product is produced. To simply trace it, I'm not convinced that you actually need that date and time to trace the product. And then the where did this contamination potentially occur? Again, that's incredibly useful to investigate what happened, but to trace the product, just to get that, what did these people eat that was in common? I don't think you actually need to know where. I think you need to know who, what. It's kind of simple, not as simple to do. It sounds simple. When we talk about tracing forward, so then we're looking at the recall kind of scenario. Again, it's the what. So what is the product that's a problem. And the who is often what helps make the what unique. So whose product is it? It's this particular brand, for example. And any point in the supply chain needs to be able to recognize, do I have this product in my possession so that I can remove it, extract it from the supply chain? Again, it sounds pretty simple, but the way that we begin communicating this information to each other, relaying it, is clearly not that simple. So what has FDA proposed in the proposed traceability rules? So the additional records for high-risk foods. The proposed rule, as proposed, would not apply to all foods. And this was required by Congress. Congress said you can't write a rule for everything. It just has to be for high-risk foods. So there's some debate, and I appreciate that FDA did not use the word high risk, because that's kind of a misnomer. But what are the foods that really warrant additional record-keeping requirements? FDA came out with a pretty lengthy list. Produce is well represented on that list. But as you look at for the foods that would be subject to the rule, what is required, it is a lot of CTEs, so every point in the supply chain, and a lot of data elements. So CTEs stands for critical tracking event. KDE stands for key data element. And what's being proposed is a lot of information that would need to be captured and communicated. As I've worked in this field for over a decade, I've seen the evolution of technology systems, and at this point in time, feel pretty comfortable saying that, yeah, there's technology out there that can handle this quantity, this magnitude of data, but I do push back and say, is this the best way to answer the problem, to solve the problem that we're trying to solve? So yeah, the technology may be capable. It doesn't mean that the system would be particularly useful. My recommendation at this point in time is to hold off a little bit on making adjustments to your, I would not overhaul your system right now based on the proposed rule. I do expect that lot number, my hope is that the lot number will be retained as a key data element when the rule is finalized in November of 2022. But a lot of the other data elements, I'm not so sure. We submitted comments. Again, one of the things that we do as a trade association is advocate, represent the member's perspective. And I don't see that all those data elements that FDA proposed are as useful as the lot number. So I'd be cautious about adapting your system now based on the proposed rule. But do think about what is the problem that they're trying to solve, what is the problem that you need to solve, and make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. So do align on that problem and think about, for your trading partners, what information do you need to communicate to them? What information do you need to maybe have but not proactively communicate or regularly communicate to them? And then what information would need to be shared with investigators on request? And I hope that in walking through that outbreak investigation process, walking through the traceback process as it exists today, that you feel somewhat informed and inspired to think more critically about the data elements that you are capturing and ways that you can make the whole system work better. So again, the technology is there. Where I see a lot of challenges is in the processes. So when there are exceptions that are allowed, when there are things happening because people want to take shortcuts, yeah, something is supposed to be tracked, but it's actually not, because it's just not convenient. It takes too much time, there are errors. this is where I think there's an opportunity to reflect on how does your product flow? What are the data that are captured today? And how can you optimize that system, that process, and then bring in technology to capture what needs to be captured? Again, traceability is a tool, not an answer. The technology is a tool, not an answer. The supply chain is complex in food, and it continues to evolve, and I anticipate it will continue to evolve. So how do we build in some flexibility to accommodate for what may be coming down the pike? And I'm of the opinion that a minimalistic approach to product tracing may be more achievable and may get us to that minimum of the problem, to solve the problem that we need to solve. Again, depending on what problem you're trying to solve, if you're looking at it from the marketing standpoint or authentication, maybe there are other data elements that you want to address your issue to get that return on investment for you, for your company. Those would be add-ons. But strictly speaking, for product tracing, when it comes to the outbreak investigation from the regulatory perspective, I think that we can scale back compared to what's in the proposed rule. One of the things that we also should think about is how do we communicate through this complex supply chain? To me, the obvious answer is using global standards. So speaking the same language. The example that I often give is, and so I apologize if you've heard my spiel before, but it's about telephones. The fact that I can have a decades-old regular conventional landline telephone that doesn't even have a mute button, and I can still call somebody who has a high-end, all the bells and whistles type of cell phone. Mine is plugged in, the old school phone is plugged into the wall, the cell phone is not. Different carriers, different service providers, very different fees associated with the two different types of phones. But at the end of the day, they can call each other. So this is because of standards. It would be pretty ridiculous to say that a landline phone can only call a landline phone, and a cell phone, an iPhone can only call an iPhone, and only if you and the other iPhone are on Verizon. You can't wind up with a system where you have like 10 or 15 different phones and have to remember which phone calls which person. That's kind of how I feel traceability is today, with different suppliers having different systems, different formats, different buyers using different systems, and they're not connected in a way in that baseline level that enables rapid communication while still affording the flexibility to add on those bells and whistles that work for you. So choose the technology or technologies that work for you and integrate those with the supply chain partners. To me, that would be, it would just be so fantastic. With that, I want to leave you with a couple of resources, and I really want to urge you to get creative and focus on the outcome as you think about the systems and the processes that are going to work best for you. At the bottom right of this slide, I've got an example of a PTI label. So this is the Produce Traceability Initiative, and you can go to producetraceability.org to learn a little bit more about this effort that's been underway for many, many years. So this predates FSMA. The produce industry recognized that produce was kind of a poster child for traceability and saw an opportunity to get together as an entire community and think about how could product be traced. So this is using the GS1 128 barcode. It's using the GS1 system of standards, global standards, to identify, the who and what, the lot number, and here the pack date. So it's embedded, that information is embedded within the barcode, also available in human readable form. And I'm pleased to say that there's a work group looking at what's what's the next iteration of this? So this is a barcode. Are there other ways that we can effectively communicate standardized information through the supply chain? Another link that I'll draw your attention to is the Leafy Greens Traceability Pilot. This was several associations on the produce space, GS1, retail side, FMI participated, as well as IFT. And this was a fascinating exercise because it was kind of like the secret shopper. We had people go out, purchase Leafy Greens products, as one would, just as an ordinary consumer, and then constructed a fictitious scenario where this product caused illness. And the secret shopper took photographs of the, whatever information was available on the package. If there was a lot number, a date, UPC, whatever, but did not share that with this kind of mock fictitious FDA investigative team. So this was a handful of industry experts, and they were tasked with figuring out how can you determine what made somebody sick. If you have very limited information, you just know that the person purchased some leafy green at some specific retail store, restaurant. In some cases, a shopper card was provided. In some cases, credit card information was provided. And how would they work back through the supply chain? Are there other ways that we can get creative and think about what is that problem? How do we determine where this product actually came from, given the complexity of a supply chain? So if you have a minute, I strongly encourage you to read that report, read the method, and then also read there were 3 pilots that were conducted. Look at how the groups tackled this problem. And I hope that it is something that motivates you to, maybe do an exercise yourself and see how would you trace product through your own supply chain if you can get your supply chain partners on board. Very, very different than a recall. This is not a mock recall. A mock traceback is not a mock recall. But a couple of other resources for you, an article that was recently published in the Packer, which is Produce Industry Trade Press, on some of the complexity, some of the nuances associated with produce industry traceability, and then also our website, freshproduce.com, where under the resources, whether you go to the food safety side or the supply chain side, you can find additional resources related to traceability. So with that, I am happy to take some questions. I know we've got a fair amount of time, and I am game for pretty much any question, I think. So
Awesome.
Aaron, I'll turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Well, Jennifer, thank you. I've got 2 huge pages of notes, and I know we've got questions coming in, but I'm going to selfishly grab a couple first. And before that, I did want to echo a couple of things that you said and really pound it home. Like, one, it is an absolute critical first step to understand what you're looking to accomplish before you apply anything, a process change or a technology, right? You have to understand, clearly identify, and get the stakeholders in your broader work groups to understand that's the true north, that's the direction we're going. I would add to it, if there's a way that when you try to look at something that you want to accomplish, to put a metric to it. So how do you know if you accomplished it? Describe what that looks like, so that as you begin the process of looking at solutions or changing processes or whatever it is, that the method you want to kind of go and whether it's continual improvement or other, you have a sort of destination in mind. You can clearly say, hey, we got there, we did this. So I love that you take that approach, Jennifer. It is absolutely the best way to do it. And your point about might have some processes, right, that you have to look at first, that is very critical. So if we're in the software business, obviously, but we're the first to say, wait a second, before we implement any software, we want to make sure we look at the processes. Is this the right process? Is there some changes that need to be made? Because if you automate anything with software and you're automating a process of any kind, right, whether it's traceability or quality management system or whatever, if you automate bad, that doesn't help your organization or your customers ever. So definitely look at the processes. I appreciate that approach. So Jennifer, we've had some of our packaging customers ask whether their products may be required to sort of be involved in traceability. So can you talk to, like, let's say like a clamshell, right? Like those plastic manufacturers, clamshell for a head of lettuce or something along those lines. Can you offer any guidance or input or thoughts on how packaging customers may have to look at traceability? Is this on the radar? Is it not?
Sure. So, I think that part of what makes it a little complicated is that we have a regulation related to traceability today. So that one up, one down is in effect today, and that covers, for FDA regulated products, really all registered facilities. It doesn't include farms and it doesn't include restaurants, but it covers everybody else. And it's the basic information of, what'd you get, who'd you get it from. So that's in effect, and that is not going away. So the proposed rule, what we often call FSMA 204, is an add-on. It's above and beyond. It's limited to a subset of foods that are on that high-risk food list, and that is where additional records would be required to be kept. So I think, and this may be a great question for the FDA Technical Assistance Network, their TAN, but to get clarity around, as the new rule is finalized, my expectation is that it will be the handlers of those foods that wind up on the list. It may be the same as what we saw in the proposed rule. The list may be tweaked, but I believe it is those who are actually producing, receiving, shipping those foods that are on the list that need to track information about the food, especially the lot number of the food. I don't recollect that rule would require anything special, anything above and beyond for the packaging materials, for the suppliers of packaging materials to those products. Again, we have the old rule is still in effect, and that's pretty big.
Very good. And you're talking about the FTL, right? The food traceability list when you're talking about those. So, and that makes sense. I appreciate that. And then is there a second, and we've got a couple other questions, is there, Jennifer, is there any recommended approach or any guidance you'd give, broadly speaking, to anyone, especially in the produce world or any food in general, to review that traceback and traceforward process to make sure that, hey, is this something you want to do yearly? Is this something that you want to do a mock recall yearly? Or what is there any guidance that you give for reviewing and testing those processes?
Yes, and when I was working at IFT, the Institute of Food Technologists, and we did the traceability pilots that were required by Congress as part of Section 204, one of the recommendations that we made was to have companies do a mock traceback. Companies ordinarily do mock recalls, usually to satisfy an audit requirement, and the mock recalls, as I've seen them constructed, are usually you start with something that's known. We have this particular ingredient, it's this lot number. What were all the finished products that this ingredient wound up in, and who did we send them to? So that's like one example of people will call that a traceability, kind of to satisfy their mock recall. But as I explained a couple minutes ago, the trace back piece is when something is unknown and you're trying to figure out what did these things have in common. It's a much more difficult test to construct, and it's particularly difficult to construct this kind of a test as it works through an entire supply chain.
Yeah.
So
that makes a difference.
It is different. I still think, to me, it's incredibly useful
Mhm.
if you
Mhm.
can get it done. And it's something that, I'm happy to kind of share a construct of how one could do it, how one could try to structure it. Those leafy green pilots that I referred to at the end, that will be, I hope, helpful to people to think about how would they want to mimic this if they wanted to
Okay.
do this sort of exercise. Because I feel pretty strongly that the mock recall that you do is not an adequate test of your traceability system, especially if you're concerned that you might be involved in an outbreak investigation.
Hmm. That's good to know. And by the way, yeah, I can't plug this enough. What Jennifer shared with us here on the screen, the leafy greens, the pilots, check them out. Definitely the PTI, very cool. That was where you had the modes or the models, or I'm sorry, the methods, right? That you were recommending people go take a look at those methods in the PTI. Is that right?
Actually, in the leafy greens traceability pilot, so it's written up as a kind of a like a little research report, and we talk about the method for each of the 3 case studies or 3 pilots that were done, how the groups tackled it. So that would be my top recommendation if you're looking to exercise your own system.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that clarification. All right, we've got some. Dustin has a good question. Jennifer, do you see scannable lot code information becoming mandatory for manufacturers to aid in the conformance to this rule?
Mandatory from a regulatory perspective, no, I don't. I would be very surprised for a couple of reasons. First of all, because FDA usually is not very prescriptive in that type of process, like scanning.
Yeah.
They have to do, whenever they finalize a rule or even propose a rule, they have to do a cost analysis. So how much is it going to cost the industry, and then what's the public health benefit? And I think when you start to look at very specific types of systems, it becomes difficult for FDA to make the case that locking everybody into one system is the right way to go. I also think that if FDA were to require something like scanning lot codes, that's not, who knows what the future holds. We may have totally different technologies, totally different opportunities available in the future, and we don't
Mhm.
want to be stuck. I wouldn't want to be stuck with today's technology. So
Yeah.
I think there are some good reasons to be a little more flexible and a little more outcome oriented. If you're going to be scanning a lot code, why are you scanning the lot code today? What is it that you actually need? And maybe there are ways other than scanning the lot code that you can get to that same answer.
Fantastic. Very good. We have another comment here. Diane says she likes the telephone example, and what it does not take into account is the interoperability that is not just based on standards, but also on tremendous and ongoing investments by several telecom companies into network infrastructures. This is her opinion, Diane. Thank you so much. I love it. That's what's missing in traceability, she says. Any comments to add to that?
Yeah, back when we did do the traceability pilots, there were 2 components to the work. There was the pilot itself tracing, but then we also were tasked to do an economic evaluation. And one of the things is we had some economists looking at the systems, the capabilities, the technologies that were out there. One of the things that I found most interesting, a comment that stuck with me, is that when we're looking, especially at outbreak investigations, we're looking at a societal benefit. And so one economist was of the opinion that this should be a bigger, broader investment, that it shouldn't be up to one company or a couple of companies or even the industry to make these kind of infrastructure like investments, because it is for the good of society. And as an individual company, you can say, well, the likelihood that I'm going to be involved in an outbreak is extremely low. Why should I make this investment? So trying to think about this a different way. And I think that's an excellent comment, looking at the infrastructure that's needed to support a whole entire system. Point well taken.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. Patricia has a good question. We often use words and they're general in nature. Her question is pretty simple. What does integrating, quote unquote, integrating the recall traceability system with the supply chain look like, right? And I wouldn't mind, I'll take a crack at this, but I would want you to clean up any mess that I create, Jennifer. But integrating is really just the process of making sure the communications are linked, right? And integrating can mean a lot of things, right? You can integrate with equipment, you can integrate with sensors, you can integrate with your barcodes and be able to share that. The idea is that there's to not say it infrastructure, there's generally, in my opinion, should be a cloud-based system that has the ability to share across stakeholders. Sometimes that's as simple as something inside your facility, but often you have to go outside of your facility. But then there's security measures that have to also be taken into consideration. So the integrating the system is really just a matter of sharing information. What would you say? How far off of the mark am I there, Jennifer?
No, I would absolutely agree. And I think oftentimes we think about, and certainly I'm probably a little guilty of this as well, think about sharing information between companies or between locations, between supply chain partners. But that sharing of information internally is just as important. So, as we think about the receiving, processing, warehousing, shipping out, there may be many systems just within the four walls of a facility that also need to talk to each other. So it becomes, although sometimes I do make it sound simplistic, what the outcome should be, the process of getting systems to talk to each other to a meaningful end is not necessarily simple.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Good. Another question here. Why use the word traceback when in an industry recall we need to trace back? This is so confusing. So I think it's worthy of just a little bit of discussion, Jennifer, just to kind of say, and I think there was a slide here. Let me see if I can get to it. I think it was this one right here. So recall and traceback. She's confused. Seems like, or is it this one that you want to kind of focus on?
No, go back to the other one. So recall is usually a trace forward.
Mm-hmm.
So the food is known, there's a particular contaminated food. The contamination happened at a very specific point in time and a very specific location. And then the recall traces forward from there. Where did this food go?
Yes.
The trace back is looking at it in the total opposite direction. So where did food or foods come from, and do they have something in common? There can be a relationship if you say, I have a contaminated ingredient and I follow it. Well, it becomes a web. As you're recalling products, we know that ingredients go into other ingredients, become other ingredients, but you can point the arrows basically in opposite directions for a recall and a trace back.
Yeah, and I like the idea here. So it might be worthy kind of going through this exercise. So we know, hey, if it's a recall, we know the food, we know where it came from. You start with the producer and go forward to understand the full impact of where this recall is at, right? Is it local? Is it just a small area? Or did this get distributed to a bigger, broader region, right? So that's why you go through that recall. You're going forward from the product origination to say, hey, where could this all have been? Whereas in a traceback, we're just starting with somebody sick.
Correct.
and we think that something's going on, we need to go do the investigation to find where that food is. And then in a traceback situation, Jennifer, when we do find, when the FDA does find source of product and all of that, is it then it may cause a recall, and then you're going to go back forward, you're going to go forward again to then reassess what was the impact, where was the region, how widespread was this? Is that an accurate statement?
That was expertly explained. Yes.
Perfect. Yeah. And by the way, this is, I've had this, so for those of you that have this question, I have had this too, and I've been in the, this is, you know, it's good to know. So I'm gonna leave us here. I wanna get to, and I wanna make sure you all go visit freshproduce.com. One wonderful website, great resources. They're also building this out, so keep checking back for freshproduce.com, okay? And Jennifer's been so kind, she's left us her email here if you did have any questions following this this presentation of Beyond Compliance. So a couple of other things coming up I want to make you aware of. There's definitely more resources at safetychain.com. We do have some webinars coming up. We've got a replay about our food safety KPIs. Are they driving the right behaviors? That was a really interesting conversation that we had with the Atchison group about unintended consequences. There's this really cool analogy about snakes that you want to check out. It's very interesting. Then actually in a couple of days, join us FSMA Fridays. We're going to talk chemophobia. So, and I think this is a really interesting take on what the market perceives versus what the regulations sort of should be. And there's this middle ground, this gray area that we're going to tackle. So that's very cool. And then we're going to, in February, get into some OEE, how to calculate financial impact of OEE improvements. And then we're also going to be getting in another discussion with Mariu NutriSciences for audits. That's always a huge one. Please go check those out on safetychain.com. And Jennifer, thank you again for showing up. This has been fantastic. I always learn something new. Again, I've got like 2 pages of notes. I'll probably send you some thoughts, and I appreciate your time.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everybody for listening.
Absolutely. All right, that'll wrap it up for us. Beyond Compliance. Go out there, make us proud, make us safe, and have a great week. Thanks.